Hey everyone, welcome back. We have some learning to do. We kind of left off just sort of kicking off this chapter 10 in your digital textbooks on, this covers basic form and function and then tissues, which is very colorful and very fun. I know we went through kind of this. You had a little coloring sheet, which please, if you're done with that coloring sheet, how about if I just set up a folder in Classroom and you can turn that in to the folder so that I have a means by which to check that and give you some credit for that. We talked about these basic body plans. We talked about metabolism and difference in size. We talked about surface area to volume ratio. I know we just kind of mentioned this. The large cells stay small because as they get larger, that surface area to volume ratio actually decreases, and that's really a big problem as far as getting nutrition all the way into the cell. I think we mentioned this, metabolic rate and metabolism. I think perhaps we are right about here. So these are the body planes. I know we talked about a couple of them already, but here's a few more. So they actually show it on a goat and a human, two different sort of body, the quadruped and the bipedal. So we have the mid-sagittal plane. So, and these actually are defined on the next slide. So you'll notice it says the sagittal plane divides that body into right and left portions, but not necessarily equal left and right portions. If it's actual equal left and right, then we call it the mid-sagittal plane. So if we're talking about just the sagittal plane, it could be, you know, far to the right or far to the left on here and still be considered the sagittal plane. So there's, you know, again, it's mid sagittal if it's exactly centered. And then of course we have a frontal plane, and then the transverse or horizontal plane dividing into upper lower. And we can even go into more detail with cross section and oblique. I can't right off the top of my head, I don't remember how many of those are actually on your little coloring sheet. But that's why I gave you that. Like, it is important for you to learn and understand those, but we're not going to spend a ton of time on them, to be honest. And then when we go into body cavities, we only have a handful of really major cavities. So when we talk about the back portion, so this in here, so if I said, oops, someone just came in. All right, sorry about that. It's a little crazy around here. So we say the dorsal cavity is like the whole back, kind of the back cavity of the body. Let me go. I want to get rid of that. That's right. All right. Cranial cavity, we're always talking about where the brain is, the cranium, the cranial cavity. Thoracic cavity right here. This is the diaphragm. This is this very thin tissue that separates that upper and lower cavity. The upper cavity, your heart and lungs, obviously then are located in that thoracic cavity. And then the abdominal cavity, this is all your digestive system, intestines and so forth. And then of course we have the pelvic cavity, which is kind of, sometimes we say abdominal pelvic cavity and we sort of combine some of that. And we call this whole front cavity, then the whole front part here all together is called the ventral cavity. I think dorsal is should be easy to remember, because if you think about fish and and that dorsal fin being on the back, I think that's one really good way to remember that dorsal cavity. And then, you know, the opposite then is the ventral cavity, which is the whole front part. So plural, whenever we talk about plural, we're usually, you know, so the pleural cavity around the lungs, pericardial Plural always refers to lungs. Pericardial refers to the heart. And we already said abdominal, pelvic, of course, the pelvic area. And then we are going to talk specifically about each of the 4 major tissue types. So remember we talked earlier about that hierarchy and how a group of cells, sorry I'm writing with my mouse because I'm at school, a group of cells working together actually make up tissues. That's that hierarchy, and tissues make up organs and so on. So we're going to spend time in this chapter talking about all the different types of tissues. There's 4 major categories, but of course these are broken down into much more specific content, specific specialized tissues as well. So for example, there's several types of muscular tissue, there's several types of connective tissue, and so on. The first type of tissue that your book goes through is the epithelial tissue. So a lot of times we think of epithelial as skin, right? I think for many people that's the first thing that comes to mind. However, obviously we have epithelial that's not just on the outside of our body. But if we think of skin, it's that tight, that continuous network that forms that covering. Well, we have the same basic type of tissue, this epithelial tissue that lines body cavities, covers those body surfaces, and even we find it in glands. So it is always about protection, sometimes about absorption, and also secretion, how like through our skin we actually get rid of things. So for example, I don't know, one example that comes to mind is certainly absorption. There are some things like that can be absorbed through the skin. Not everything, of course, which think of it as like that cell membrane and that's selectively permeable. So some things can pass through that skin layer, that epithelial layer, and some things cannot. So if I want to quit smoking, one of the devices that actually can be helpful is a patch that delivers certain drugs that can help me kick that habit. So nicotine patches and that kind of thing. Secretion, there are lots of things that are secreted through our skin. If you, for example, consume alcohol, obviously alcohol is not good for our bodies. And one of the ways we get rid of alcohol, obviously through our urinary system, but also secreted through the skin. You can oftentimes tell the scent someone's actually oils that they secrete through the skin. You can a lot of times smell that alcohol content. So these cells are anchored by some sort of basement or underlying membrane on one side, free on the other side. And we have lots of different types of epithelial. And it kind of says they're named after appearance, and so we're going to go into some detail on that just in the next few slides. One example would be transitional epithelium changes, appearance in response to tension. Okay, so if basically this is saying those transitional epithelial cells, if where there's tension, they actually can change in appearance when that occurs. We have 2 main ways that we classify, still talking about those epithelial cells or epithelial tissue. So the cells in epithelial tissue are classified either by the number of layers, that's the first part, or by the shape. So if you can just remember that there's those 2 categories. And then we have, I just love some amazing pictures, and we'll do a lab that looks at even more pictures and even more detail than this. So so the first one is squamous cells. You see these kind of slightly irregular. These are okay, so it says centrally located nucleus. These little clues down here are actually important. If you'll have to identify these in pictures. So this is strictly like you have some memorization to do here, and it starts with this, right? So what do these look like? Again, centrally located nucleus, that's important. These can be stratified into layers, which guess what? These are the exact, right here, these are the kind of cells that we find in our skin. And we also, the other picture here is the human cervix. So for females, the cervix is, yeah, like the opening that the cervix kind of opens, and that's, or the cervix dilates during childbirth, and the child passes through that cervix. So this is just showing some of those squamous epithelial cells in layers in a woman's cervix. If you're a guy, you do not have one of these. You're not going to have babies. This is a woman thing. So you will notice it says that these squamous cells are flat and then also irregular round. So what happens with our skin cells, the skin on the outside of our bodies, these squamous cells are exactly what we have. So they start out as kind of, kind of thicker, irregular, roundish shape. And as we shed our skin cells from our surface, the underlying skin cells then become the surface cells. The closer they get to the surface, the flatter they get. It is really important for skin cells to be flat in shape because it helps cover more surface area. So as they move to the surface, they become flatter. And then, of course, the very outer surface of our skin, those cells are completely dead and very flat and form a nice protective covering. There's natural oils in there that keep them from cracking, but you are constantly shedding those squamous cells. The second type of epithelial cell are cuboidal epithelial, so cube-shaped. Again, we still see that central nucleus. That's important. I'm not totally. I like when the name tells you exactly, it explains what the structure looks like. These are called cuboidal, but they're really a little bit more pie-shaped. But they're definitely not round. Okay, and you can see it says these line like the tubules in the mammalian kidney. There's tons of little tubes and blood vessels in the mammalian kidney, and there needs to be because this is such a blood filtering organ. So this is this is like a small tubule that we would find in there, and look at how these, right, they line the inside of this tubule, right? If this is the tubule, completely lined on the inside with those cuboidal epithelial. So obviously these would be important in maintaining that structure and filtering the blood. The third one here, columnar epithelia. They look like a column. Again, if you just sort of look at those structures and just remember, so these are columnar. This is one big long cell. All of these are. We know it's one cell because there's one nucleus, and I could see the top and the bottom, all the way through. Some of these columnar epithelial have specific shapes. These are actually called goblet cells. That's one specific shape of these columnar epithelial. And they look kind of like a wine goblet. That's where the name comes from. And these are just straight up columnar. They don't have that goblet shape. Kind of the same thing, just slightly different shape of the same thing. So we give it a specialized name if they're shaped like a goblet, but they're still columnar epithelia. And then pseudo-stratified. So pseudo in science, pseudo means false. So we might say in science, we say a lot of times astronomy is a pseudoscience. It's not really a science, it's a fake science. It's sort of fun and people look at their horoscopes for fun, but it's really not science. These cells are not really stratified. They're not really in layers. They just kind of look like that, but they're really these tall